It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tad Schmaltz from the University of Michigan, who's going to talk to us about moral evil and divine concurrence in the Theodicy.
Thanks. And I want to start by joining others in expressing my appreciation to Mike and Sam for organizing this splendid celebration of the Theodicy. I'm also grateful because I'm a little bit outside of the Society of Serious Leibniz Scholars. So thanks for letting me crash the party. I'm speaking today on moral evil and divine concurrence in the Theodicy. I'll be departing from the text that you have at various points. So if you get tired of trying to find out where I am, I do have a handout, which I'll refer you to various passages. And in some cases, the passages are more completely contained there, or contains the complete passage, whereas in the text it just talks about bits of it. So you might want to look there as we go along. The handout's in the packet, right? I think it's before the actual text. So just a little history of this paper. It derives from a puzzle over what might seem to be a sort of small technical issue in the Theodicy. Why does Leibniz allow, at several points in the Theodicy, that God wills physical evil, but consistently insists that God does not will, but merely permits moral evil? Now, as I pursued this puzzle, it led me on to Leibniz's views on deep metaphysical issues concerning God's various kinds of concurrence with physical and moral evil. So I want to talk about what I've learned on that journey, considering that initial puzzle. So I'm going to begin with Leibniz's account of moral evil and its distinction from physical evil. I did have a discussion of metaphysical evil that I'm going to skip over. We had a nice discussion of that the last session. And I think what's most important for my purposes is the distinction between physical and moral evil. In the Theodicy, Leibniz claims that the moral evil of sinful free human action introduces the most difficult, greatest difficulty for divine conduct. So I'm going to attempt to explain why this sort of evil is so problematic for Leibniz. Then I'm going to consider Leibniz's proposed solutions in the Theodicy to difficulties concerning the two kinds of divine concurrences with moral evil, that is sin, the difficulties they introduce for divine conduct. In the case of moral concurrence, the apparent fault is one of omission. God is responsible for sin insofar as he fails to prevent sins that he knows will occur and that he has the power to prevent. One aspect of Leibniz's solution to this problem is relatively straightforward. God is justified in refraining from preventing sin, since without the sin, this would not be the best of all possible worlds. However, his additional claim that God merely permits and does not will sinful action helps to explain, I think, his stress on the difficulty that concerns divine moral concurrence in particular. In the case of God's physical concurrence, that's the second kind of concurrence with moral evil, the apparent fault is one of commission. God is the author of sin insofar as he acts with created agents to produce sinful actions. In the Theodicy, Leibniz addresses this problem by offering a version of the privation theory that he had ridiculed in his earlier writings. According to this theory, God concurs in sinful action by producing the perfections of that action, whereas created agents contribute the privations that result in the sinfulness of the action. As other commentators have noted, this theory seems to attribute an overly negative role to created agents, and thus to conflict with Leibniz's commitment to genuine causal activity on the part of creatures. However, I claim that one important point of his discussion of God's physical concurrence with moral evil is that privations in creatures serve as a special kind of what he calls a deficient cause of sin, with which God does not physically concur. In brief concluding remarks, I argue that when this point concerning physical concurrence is coupled with certain features of Leibniz's account of moral evil, it serves to support his claim that God merely permits sinful action in morally concurring with it. Okay, so section 1, the nature of moral evil. Maria Rosa cited this passage from the Theodicy: evil may be taken metaphysically, physically, and morally. Metaphysical evil consists in simple imperfection, physical evil in suffering, and moral evil in sin. So I'm going to focus on the distinction between physical and moral evil. So in the case of physical evil, we identify it with suffering, or Leibniz does, which indicates that this kind of evil requires sentience. In the new essays, Leibniz defines pleasure as a sense of perfection and pain as a sense of imperfection, each notable enough for one to become aware of it. According to Leibniz's late metaphysical view, what distinguishes animal and rational souls from bare monads is the fact that whereas the latter have only unconscious perceptions, the former have a faculty of memory that gives them the ability to notice perceptions they have retained. Now, you might think, given this view, that animals can suffer physical evil, but actually in the Theodicy, and I think this is a passage Nick discussed, Leibniz claims that even though non-intelligent beasts have perceptions of pain and pleasure, still they do not have the sort of reflection required for genuine happiness and misery. The suggestion here is that true physical goods and evils are restricted to rational souls. Then there's the category of moral evil. In the Theodicy, Leibniz claims, and this is passage C in your handout, that moral evil is restricted to the actions of a free substance insofar as it determines itself by itself, and thus according to the motive of the good perceived by the understanding, which inclines it without necessitating it. This passage reflects three conditions for free action required for moral evil, namely intelligence, spontaneity, and contingency. With respect to these conditions, we can say first that the fact that the free substance acts according to the motive of the good perceived by the understanding shows that it has what Leibniz calls intelligence, and that's why it can take place only in a rational soul. The fact that the free substance determines itself by itself shows that it has a special kind of spontaneity. When Leibniz discusses spontaneity, he sometimes has in mind the implication of his theory of pre-established harmony, that all substances, and not just rational minds, are the sole created causes of their own states. In Leibniz's mature thought, the claim is that appetites in a created substance serve as the created cause of changes in its conscious or unconscious perceptions. These appetites act according to the laws of final causes, and their effects correspond to the effects produced in bodies by mechanical laws of efficient causation. John Rutherford has characterized this as the view that appetites operate according to what he calls the law of natural teleology, which dictates the transition in a simple substance or monad to a state that is objectively the best for the monad to be in next. That's Don's phrase. And in particular, the state that is required for the world to be in the best one possible. This broad kind of spontaneity ensures that the various states that substances produce in themselves by means of their appetites harmonize with one another so as to be part of the best possible world. Nonetheless, a narrower kind of spontaneity is indicated by Leibniz's claim that the free substance determines itself, quote from Leibniz, according to the motive of the good perceived by the understanding. To borrow from Don again, in this case, the substance operates according to the law of desire teleology, which dictates action in accord with what the substance perceives to be the state of greatest goodness relative to it. Whereas all substances are broadly spontaneous, since they produce their own perceptual changes in accord with the law of natural teleology, Only the free action of rational minds can exhibit the sort of narrow spontaneity that involves the production of change by means of motives that are guided by the law of desire, teleology. Finally, there's Leibniz's claim that the perception of the motive that leads to free action inclines without necessitating. Here, the requirement is that the action be contingent and so preclude logical or metaphysical necessity. However, in the Theodicy, Leibniz repeatedly denies that this sort of contingency involves a stronger sort of freedom of indifference that is incompatible with the determination of the action. His view is rather that, this quote from Leibniz from the Theodicy, the will always follows the most advantageous representation, distinct or confused, of the good or the evil that results from reasons, passions, or inclinations, end quote. This is in virtue of the fact that the will of a rational mind follows what Donne has described as the law of desire, teleology. According to this law, the strongest desire, namely the one for the greatest apparent good for the agent, determines the action of the free will. This action remains contingent and thus merely inclines without necessitating, since the choice to pursue a good is based not on the perception that the good is the only logical possible one, but rather on the perception that it is overall the best for the agent. If agents had only distinct perceptions of the good, there would be no sin. Indeed, this is the case with God, who always is led by his perfect understanding to freely choose what is in fact the best. But even though intelligent creatures are similar to God in being inclined towards an intellectually perceived good, nonetheless they, according to Leibniz, are subject to some passions, or to perceptions at least, that are not composed entirely of adequate ideas, end quote. In virtue of being subject to the imperfection of having passions or confused perceptions, created agents are able to misrepresent their true good, and so to choose what is merely an apparent good. In the Theodicy, Leibniz explicitly allows, with respect to physical evil, that, quote, God is its author, when the moral evil is assumed to be already in existence, end quote. God's authorship of physical evil can be justified since he wills the evil not absolutely as an end, but rather as a means to greater goods, and ultimately to the best possible total effect. One might anticipate that he also would say that God's the author of moral evil, and that his authorship of this evil can be justified in just the same way. Yet Leibniz does not say this. Instead, he emphasizes, in passage D, that God merely permits the moral evil, that is the source of physical evil. So why this difference between physical and moral evil? That's the puzzle I started with. Surely it's relevant here that the internal causes of the physical and moral evils differ in a fundamental way. We can highlight this difference by considering an objection to Leibniz's doctrine of pre-established harmony that Pierre Bayle offered in his Historical and Critical Dictionary. In note H to the article Rorius, Bayle claims that this doctrine has the absurd consequence that the soul of a dog produces in itself the transition from the pleasant state of eating while hungry to the painful state that results from a blow to its body. The suggestion is that the dog surely would not have a desire for the painful state reflected in the appetite that produces it. In response, passage E, Leibniz insists on the distinction from the quote between the spontaneous and the voluntary. The principle of change is in the dog, the disposition of the soul that moves it imperceptibly towards giving it pain, but this is without its knowing and without its wanting it. The representation of the present state of the universe in the dog's soul produces in it the representation of the subsequent state of the same universe, just as in the things represented the preceding state actually produces the subsequent state of the world. And since the subsequent state of the world includes the blow on the dog's body, the representation of that subsequent state in the soul includes the pain which corresponds to that blow. Since the appetite in the dog is directed toward producing the state that is best for the world, rather than for the dog itself, it produces a state that's painful. And I added here, in the text, and thus involves physical evil. But I wouldn't say that in light of